And I'm going to start off by talking to you about what the key findings are of our preliminary work. Then I'm going to go a bit more in depth into what the study's been about, this preliminary work we're doing, and then I'm going to talk a bit about the next steps of where we're going with this research, and perhaps when we get to the questions you might have some suggestions about how we take this forward. Okay, so our key findings are that we've found 8 distinct neighbourhood groupings which we can classify according to the level of crime and crime drop. And most neighbourhoods have experienced a drop in crime, but the scale is varying by neighbourhood groupings. So crime is falling in many neighbourhoods, but the level of crime, whether high, medium or low crime, and I'll show you some slides which explain this a bit further, has remained stable. And there's a distinct geographical pattern in our study area of high, medium, low crime neighbourhoods, with the city centre ones getting the highest level of crime and the highest crime drop. Now, our high, medium and low crime neighbourhoods groups vary in size and in their contribution to the absolute crime drop. So our highest crime neighbourhoods make up only 1% of neighbourhoods. They're quite rare, but they're contributing 10% of the overall fall in crime across the study period. Our low crime neighbourhoods comprise over half of all our neighbourhoods, but they're only giving about quarter of the aggregate crime drop. Why are we looking at crime drop at all? Why do we care? Why do we care about looking at it at the local level? Well, Brian's already given us a really good explanation of those varying explanations of the crime drop, and there are many. But actually, all these explanations so far have generally been at the national level, and people aren't even looking at the regional or the much more local neighbourhood level. So do these explanations resonate at the neighbourhood level? Secondly, what's the policy relevance of this research? Well, if we're talking about these levels of crime and different levels of contribution, then probably it makes sense for us to be able to identify at neighbourhood level where these different areas are. So using these techniques, we can potentially identify areas that have had significant drops in crime and look at what is the policing practice in these areas, what else has been happening in these areas to identify lessons for preventing crime elsewhere. There's also something which in criminology is quite often referred to as the reassurance gap. And the reassurance gap happens because whilst crime is falling, if you ask people whether they think crime is going down locally, they quite often will say, no, I don't think crime's changed, or they might even tell you crime is going up. Now, why might people actually feel like that? If you can identify areas that have actually seen quite a small drop in crime, then people might feel that crime's not reducing very much in their area. And people who live in those areas might require additional reassurance that crime is reducing in the area because they're just not really noticing it or seeing it on the ground. So what are we looking at here? Well, what we've been using is data that's actually published on crime, and at a local level, that's quite limited in Scotland. So we've been using data that has been gathered together for the Scottish Index of Multiple Deprivation. And it's created from police recorded crime data, and there are offences of crimes of violence, domestic housebreaking, drugs offences, minor assault and vandalism. When they were putting together the data, they excluded crimes within 50 metres of a police station. This was partly because people arrived at the police station, were told to turn out their pockets. They were full of drugs. Suddenly there was huge spikes in areas with police stations, so they were removed from the data to make it a little more stable. Also, to preserve anonymity of areas with very low levels of crime, some data is excluded, but not just data on low areas, data on areas which might be high but neighbouring those areas. So not all the data for everywhere in Scotland is available. And the level of local neighbourhood that we're using for this is Scottish data zones. And these were designed from census data to have populations with similar characteristics between 500 and 1,000 people, a mean of 800 people. Susan's been talking about the importance of controlling for population size. We haven't actually done this specifically in this work, although we are looking to do that in the future, and I'll come back to that. But the data zones themselves are of a similar size, or at least were at the start of the study period. Our study area that we're looking for is the Greater Glasgow Division, which is the local authorities of City of Glasgow, East Derwentshire and East Renfrewshire. And we're using a technique which helps us find distinct groups of statistically significant groups that are following similar trajectories. So they've got similar mean levels of crime in each time period. 3 broad groups of 8 distinct crime drop trajectories. There are 3 time periods: 2004, 2007-8 and 2010-11. Okay, so we're finding 2 distinct small groups of very high and high areas, and these are well above the average crime in the study areas. But they're the minority of the areas. They're only 1% of data zones in our area. Then we've got these medium groups. Again, if you look, they're all falling. 3 further medium level groups which are at or slightly above the mean level of crime, and these are making up just under half, 46% of all data zones in our area. And then finally we've got these low groups, these 3 low groups, and they're making up over half of the area. Again, they're all falling. Okay. What about the spatial pattern then? This is spatial data. Well, if you have a look, we're seeing a concentration of high crime, those red areas towards the centre, and there's possibly some evidence of perhaps some sort of distance decay here. You've got high groups near the centre, medium groups around the centre, and low groups towards the boundary. But not necessarily. Those of you who are familiar with Glasgow might realise that this over here, this blue area, is the West End, where you're reasonably close to the centre, but you've got sort of low groups occurring. This will be something we're considering further as the work progresses, as we consider what neighbour characteristics are actually varying at distance. Okay, so I talked about this in the findings. The areas with high crime groups are seeing the most dramatic absolute drops in crime than areas in medium or low groups. Relative falls in crime are quite similar. So if we look at the data zones in each group where crimes actually fell, high areas see the largest absolute falls and low areas see the smallest. There's quite a sort of steady trend here. We've got the high areas seeing these biggest drops, small areas seeing these smallest absolute drops. Not everywhere sees a crime fall. So I said this technique puts different groups together in similar bands. So what you actually find is in our high group, in our very high group, 100% of them have seen small drops. It's a really small number of areas. About 83% in our next high crime group. Our medium groups actually go from 67% to 73%. So if you're in this medium group here, and you're lucky enough to be in the over third of areas that hasn't seen a crime fall, then people are telling you crime is dropping. Well, crime hasn't dropped for you. And then our low groups, again, they're a bigger proportion seeing drops, but not everywhere. So crime might be low in your area, but it hasn't fallen. The relative crime drop is actually quite similar. And in fact, the low areas, and in fact this area particularly low, I've actually seen some of the biggest relative drops, but that's from quite low to a bit lower. So it's a relative bigger fall, but that's because partly those relative falls are bigger because we're dealing with smaller numbers. So high, medium and low crime groups are varying in the size and their contribution to the absolute crime drop. I said before, high areas, 1%, 10% of our absolute drop. Medium areas, just under half, but heading towards 2/3 of our crime drop. Low areas, they're over half, but they're only contributing about 25% of the overall drop you're seeing in our study area. So again, if you're living in a low area, you may not feel that you're contributing, that you're necessarily noticing that crime. So let's just talk a little bit about the limitations to this. We've got very few areas showing a distinct big drop from medium to low. And interestingly, when we expand our work out to all of Scotland, we did find some areas certainly dropping from the medium to the low. So it could be that if we expand to a larger sample size with more time points, then we'll actually get different patterns or more detailed patterns. We're also dealing with a limited subset of crimes and no control for population change. Now, actually, if anyone's seen the recent figures on population levels for data zones, if that's something you happen to enjoy doing, is hunting through population figures data zones, you'll actually see that there are some areas where populations have gone up quite a lot, say in the city centre of Glasgow, and a few areas where whole areas have been demolished and the population now is 0. So what we're going to be needing to do in future levels is to see. Also, so far, we've just shown you the levels. We haven't explained why we're seeing these different levels of crime in different neighbourhoods. So, just to bring this all to conclusion, assessing who the neighbourhood winners and losers are is complicated. Crime is falling, but the levels of crime seem quite high. High crime areas stay high, low crime areas stay low. So if you're in a high crime area and you go and see your friend who lives in a low crime area, where you are, you're still in a high crime area. Crime's fallen and you might be able to go, well, it's better than it was some years ago, but it's still worse than your neighbour who lives in a low crime area. And within these high, medium and low level crime neighbourhoods, crime is falling for the majority of areas, but not all. So what we now need to look at, what we're now trying to look at is what is this about? Why is this? So what we're doing is we're going to be controlling for population. We're looking at data sets with data for all data zones in the chosen study area without missing data, and we're looking at a lot more time periods over a long time period. We're going to look at crimes and offences separately, and Susan and Brian have already talked about that. Non-sexual violent crimes and property crimes separately, and see whether crime type has an effect on these kind of patterns. We also want to look at the why. What's this about? And to start with, we want to investigate how neighbourhoods with different levels and trajectories of crime might also in terms of their urban reality. We talked about that distance change from the city centre. Does deprivation at the start of the time period has effect? Do changing levels of deprivation over time matter? Has crime shifted to more deprived areas? Are areas which are deprived stuck in the high groups, the median groups, the low groups? Do urban areas really experience more crime? Does proximity to the city centre matter? These kind of questions. And obviously, we would welcome your suggestions. If you work in neighbourhoods, what's the burning issue you think that might be affecting these different levels of crime that we might need to look at? And I've been doing this project with John Bannister of Manchester Metropolitan, and AQMeN, who's actually at the back in the audience, who some of you might be familiar with his work at the University of Glasgow on the Go Well project. Thank you.